I moved into the house on the edge of town during a gray November afternoon. It was an old two-story farmhouse, sitting on a quiet street where the few neighbors kept mostly to themselves. The yard was overgrown, the paint peeling from years of neglect, and the wooden porch creaked underfoot. The price was right, and I was ready for a fresh start away from the cramped city apartment I'd outgrown. The first few nights were uneventful. The house groaned and sighed in the wind, and the floorboards whispered with every step. I told myself those sounds were normal, part of the charm of an old home. I enjoyed the quiet, the dark skies away from the city lights, the way the moonlight pooled in through the tall windows. One night, about a week after I moved in, I was woken up by a faint sound outside my bedroom window. I live alone, and the window overlooked the front porch and yard. At first, it was just a tapping noise, like fingernails drumming softly against the wood. I sat up in bed, heart thumping, listening. The tapping stopped. I convinced myself it was a tree branch blown by the wind. I lay back down, the silence returning, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stared at the darkened window, half expecting to see a shadow or some shape lurking. Nothing appeared. The next night, the tapping returned. This time, it was slower, more deliberate, and seemed closer. I threw on a robe and crept to the window. The porch light outside cast a dull amber glow, but I saw no one, just the worn wooden planks wet from the evening dew. I stepped out onto the porch, calling softly, "Hello?" No answer. The neighborhood was dead silent, except for the rustle of dry leaves skittering across the yard. The following mornings, I found muddy footprints on the porch steps. They weren't mine. I was careful to wipe my feet, and they looked old, worn, the sole pattern barely visible. I mentioned it to my neighbor, a woman named Karen, who had lived on the street for decades. She gave me a wary look and said, "You're the third person this month to mention strange things out here at night." I asked her what she meant. She said there had been reports of a figure seen wandering the neighborhood, always at night, always just standing outside someone's home. No one knew who it was or why it appeared, but it left people feeling cold, watched. I told her I hadn't seen anything yet. She warned me to keep my doors locked and avoid going out late. That night, I installed a security camera on the porch, pointing directly at the front door. It had motion detection and infrared night vision. Around midnight, the camera triggered. I hurried downstairs to check the feed on my laptop. The image was grainy, but I could see the porch steps clearly. Suddenly, a dark figure appeared, standing still just beyond the range of the porch light. It wore a long coat, but its face was obscured, either by a hood or shadow. My breath caught. The figure didn't move or blink. It just stared at the door. I stared back at the screen, heart pounding, frozen. Then, as if sensing my gaze, the figure slowly turned and melted into the darkness. The footage froze and then cut out, as if the camera had lost power. I checked the device, batteries were full, memory card intact. There was no reason for it to stop recording. The next few nights, the visits continued, the tapping at the window, footsteps pacing outside, the heavy breathing just beyond the porch light. I stopped answering the door and stopped looking out the windows. One night, I was laying in bed when the front door rattled violently, as if someone was trying to force it open. I grabbed my phone and called 911. The dispatcher said officers were on their way. I peered through the peephole and saw nothing but the empty porch swaying in the wind. When the police arrived, they found no signs of forced entry or footprints outside. No one was caught, no suspects found. They chalked it up to pranksters or animals, but I knew better. I began to research the house's history and the area's folklore. I discovered that almost a century ago, a man named Jacob Harrow lived there. He was a recluse, rumored to practice dark rituals. He vanished mysteriously one winter, leaving the house abandoned for years. Some said his spirit lingered, watching, waiting for someone to join him. One evening, I was working late in the living room when I heard a faint whisper just beyond the window. The voice was low and indistinct, but it called my name. I froze. The whisper grew louder, urgent and desperate. I pulled the curtains shut and locked the doors, but the feeling of being watched intensified. That night, the security camera caught something new. A shadowy figure appearing inside the house, moving through rooms even though I was alone. I showed the footage to Karen. She nodded gravely and said, "It's him. Jacob Harrow. He's been waiting. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I moved out the next morning, leaving behind everything. Sometimes in the dead of night, I still feel that presence, as if someone is standing just outside my window, tapping on the glass, waiting for me to answer. Story the end. It started with the quiet of a late spring night, the kind where the air is thick with moisture and the trees stand still as if holding their breath. I had just moved into a small rental house on the edge of town. It wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, a cramped kitchen, and a living room that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. But it was mine for the next year, and after years of cramped apartments, I welcomed the silence. I wasn't a superstitious person, and I certainly didn't believe in ghosts. But the first night I stayed there, I heard it, the sound of someone pacing just outside my bedroom window. I live on the 2nd floor, so it felt strange. Who would be out there? And why was no one at the front door? I told myself it was probably just a neighbor or a late-night wanderer passing by. The neighborhood was quiet, but not empty. Maybe someone was on a late walk or a jog. I tried to shake it off and went back to bed. The pacing continued for several nights after that, always starting around 1 a.m. At first, I thought maybe I was just hearing things, my mind playing tricks on me when everything else was quiet. But then I started noticing other things. One night, the pacing stopped, replaced by a soft tapping at the window. It wasn't loud, but the sound was deliberate, rhythmic, like someone trying to get my attention. When I pulled back the curtain and looked outside, there was nothing but the dark outline of the large oak tree by the window. No shadows, no movement, just silence. I locked the window tighter and told myself to ignore it. The next night, the pacing returned, but this time it moved closer. I could hear footsteps circling the house, slow and heavy, scraping against the gravel driveway. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. When the police arrived, they searched the yard and the surrounding area but found nothing. No footprints, no tire marks, no sign that anyone had been there. The officers told me it was probably some prankster or an animal, and that I should consider changing the locks. But the locks were new, installed just before I moved in. The following nights were worse. Sometimes the pacing turned into heavy thudding on the front door. The sound echoed through the quiet streets, startling me awake. Once I heard whispering through the cracks around the windows. The words were indistinct, but the tone was urgent, pleading. One evening, after a long day at work, I sat on the couch trying to calm myself. The windows were covered, the lights dimmed. Suddenly, the tapping started again, this time louder, and coming from the back door. My heart raced. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the kitchen, peeking through the back window. The yard was empty. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A pale figure standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the faint moonlight. It didn't move. It just watched. I blinked, and it was gone. I locked every door and window, but sleep eluded me. I found myself constantly listening, waiting for the next sound. One night, I set up a small voice recorder by the front door, hoping to catch whatever or whoever was out there. The next morning, I listened to the playback. For the first 30 minutes, just silence. Then faint footsteps. Then whispering voices just beneath the threshold of understanding. And then, unmistakably, a voice said my name. Not once, but several times. I showed the recording to a friend who worked in paranormal research. He took it seriously and came over with some equipment to monitor the house. That night, as we sat in the living room, the devices started picking up unusual readings, temperature drops, electromagnetic fluctuations around the windows and doors. Then, without warning, the front door slammed shut. We jumped up and ran to the door. It was locked. No breeze, no explanation. The devices kept picking up patterns, like a heartbeat in the house. The pacing outside was back, and now it was joined by a faint crying. I asked my friend if this was typical. He nodded grimly and told me the house was likely haunted by a restless spirit, one that hadn't moved on and was trying to communicate. I wanted to leave. I wanted to escape. But something kept me there. Over the next week, I researched the history of the house and the land. I found out that decades ago, a woman had disappeared from that property under mysterious circumstances. Her husband was the prime suspect, but was never charged. Rumors said her spirit lingered, trapped between worlds. One night, I heard the pacing start again. But this time, it was different. The footsteps stopped directly outside my bedroom window. A shadow appeared, barely more than a shape. I pressed my face to the glass. The shadow raised a hand and tapped once, slow and deliberate. I opened the window a crack and a cold breeze swept in, carrying the faintest whisper. Help me. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I found a small folded piece of paper on the doorstep. It was old, yellowed, with a single sentence written in shaky handwriting. I'm still here. I left the house the next day and never returned. Months later, I learned that the house had been demolished. The new owners said they found nothing but empty rooms and old memories. But sometimes, on quiet spring nights, neighbors say they still hear pacing outside where the house once stood. Story the end. It started on a quiet Sunday evening when I was living alone in my small apartment on the edge of town. The building was older, built in the late 60s, with creaky floors and thin walls. I liked it because it was cheap, close to work, and more importantly, I felt comfortable there. Or at least, I thought I did. That night, I had just finished dinner and was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed a sound outside. It was faint, but it was there. The sound of footsteps crunching softly on gravel. My apartment faced a narrow alley that led to the back parking lot, and usually it was dead silent after 10 p.m. I live alone, and the building was mostly quiet, except for a few neighbors who sometimes came and went late. I paused and listened, trying to figure out if someone was just walking by. Maybe a neighbor returning home? The footsteps stopped right outside my door, or at least that's where it sounded like they were. I felt Max, my golden retriever, shift uneasily next to me. He lifted his head and stared at the window facing the alley, ears perked. I frowned and stood up, walking over to the window. The streetlight outside flickered, casting long shadows. I strained to see if there was anyone there, but it was empty. The gravel was undisturbed. Probably just a raccoon, I muttered to myself, trying to dismiss the creeping unease. I closed the curtains and sat back down, but Max stayed alert, occasionally growling softly. About an hour later, I was getting ready for bed when the sound came again. Footsteps. This time heavier, slower. I froze, listening. It seemed to circle the building, moving back and forth, stopping and starting at irregular intervals. My heart pounded, but I told myself it was probably someone drunk or homeless wandering around. The area wasn't dangerous, but it wasn't exactly a bustling neighborhood either. I locked the door and double-checked the windows. Max sat near the door, growling low now. The footsteps stopped. I waited a long time, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, though my dreams were restless. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The dirt under the window had odd marks, like fingerprints, but smeared and blurred, as if someone had pressed their hands against the glass. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was from the rain or some animal. A few days passed, and the footsteps became more frequent, always at night. Sometimes they were accompanied by faint whispers, so quiet I couldn't make out words, but they sent a chill down my spine. Max was constantly on edge, pacing near the windows, growling at empty corners. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly to the sound of the doorbell. I don't have a doorbell. I checked my phone. No calls, no notifications. The doorbell rang again, 3 times, slow and deliberate. I looked at Max. He was trembling. I didn't dare open the door. The sound stopped, replaced by a low humming, barely audible, coming from outside. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police if needed. When I looked through the peephole, there was nothing. The hallway was empty, silent, no one there. I locked the door tighter and waited until morning. That day, I asked my neighbors if they'd seen or heard anything strange. One older woman said she'd heard footsteps outside late at night, but never saw anyone. Another said their dog had been barking furiously on several nights, and they thought it was just raccoons or kids messing around. I didn't tell them about the doorbell or the whispers. The nights grew worse. The footsteps became footsteps that stopped right outside my door, and sometimes moved up and down the hallway. I could swear I saw shadows flickering beneath my door or out of the corner of my eye. One night, I was lying awake when I heard scratching on the walls, like nails dragged across the plaster. Max barked loudly, running to the front door and whining. I felt something cold brush past my face, like a gust of wind, though every window was shut tight. The next day, I checked my security camera footage. I hadn't set it up for the hallway, but the door camera was angled toward the entryway. I saw nothing at first, just the usual empty corridor. Then, on the recording, a figure appeared for a split second. A dark silhouette standing just outside the door, unmoving. It didn't look human. Its form was tall and thin, but its edges blurred, flickering like static on an old TV. I replayed the footage dozens of times, my hands shaking. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark with Max on my lap, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Around 3 a.m., the doorbell rang again. 4 slow, deliberate rings. I didn't answer. Then the whispering started, growing louder and clearer. I could almost make out words now, cold and hollow. "Let me in." I stood up, heart racing, and whispered back, "No." The whispering stopped immediately. I held my breath, waiting for something else to happen. Then came a soft knock at the door. 3 slow knocks. I realized the knocking wasn't just on the door. It sounded like it was coming from the walls, from inside the apartment itself. I screamed, grabbed Max, and fled to my car. I didn't go back inside that night. The next day, I called a local paranormal investigator I found online, someone who specialized in hauntings and spirits. He was skeptical at first, but agreed to come check the place. He arrived late afternoon and walked through every room, setting up equipment, EMF meters, infrared cameras, audio recorders. As evening fell, we sat quietly waiting. Around midnight, his EMF meter started spiking wildly near the front door. Suddenly, we both heard the footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, circling the building. We looked at each other, tension thick in the air. Then the doorbell rang. The investigator went to the door, opened the peephole. No one there. He looked out into the hallway, empty and silent. Then the doorbell rang again, this time from inside the apartment. The old wall-mounted chime. I hadn't told him I installed it, but there it was. The whispering started up again. We both heard it clearly this time. "Let me in." The investigator told me this was not just a trick of the mind or some prank. He said it was a spirit, a presence tied to the building, maybe one that couldn't rest. He asked if I knew anything about the history of the place. I told him about the old owners, about how the building had been a boarding house in the 1940s, and how some tenants had died under mysterious circumstances. He said that sometimes spirits become attached to places where they died or were wronged, unable to move on. He suggested I try to communicate, to confront it, to tell it to leave me alone. That night I sat by the door, Max at my side, and I said aloud, "I know you're there. You're not welcome here. Please, leave me alone." The whispers faded. The footsteps stopped. For a few nights the apartment was quiet. But then, one night, I woke up to the sound of the doorbell ringing repeatedly, non-stop, like someone hammering it. I refused to get up. The whispers came back, angry this time, almost screaming. "Let me in! Let me in!" I yelled back, "No, go away." Suddenly, the door slammed shut. I felt a cold presence in the room, and Max growled ferociously. I didn't sleep again that night. The next day, I decided I couldn't live there anymore. I packed my things and moved out. Looking back, I'm convinced whatever was outside that door wasn't human. Not alive, at least. It was a ghost, or something worse, tied to the building, haunting the place. Sometimes I wonder if it followed me when I left, if it still waits outside, just beyond the threshold, whispering for me to let it in. Story, the end. It was late October when I moved into the small rental house on the edge of town. The place was cheap and modest, a 2-bedroom with a creaky porch and peeling paint, but I was eager to have my own space after years of sharing with roommates. The previous tenants had left abruptly, according to the landlord, and that was all the information I got. At first, everything seemed normal enough. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly families and retirees. On the evenings when I sat on the porch with a book or a beer, I'd see a few neighbors walking their dogs or kids playing in yards a block away. But as soon as the sun went down and darkness settled over the streets, the stillness felt wrong. There was a weight in the air that I couldn't explain. The first night, I woke around 2 a.m. to the sound of soft tapping coming from outside the window beside my bed. At first, I thought it was rain or branches brushing against the glass, but when I sat up and listened, the taps came again. Slow, deliberate. 3 knocks, then a pause, then 2. I strained to hear more, but the sound stopped. I sat frozen in the dark, heart pounding. Outside, the streetlights flickered faintly. I glanced out the window but couldn't see anything. No movement, no shadows. I told myself it was nothing, probably an animal or a prankster playing around. The next few nights passed without incident, and I started to relax. But on the fourth night, the taps returned, this time at the front door. I was home alone. 3 sharp knocks, then a pause, then 2 more. I didn't recognize the pattern, but it felt intentional, as if someone was trying to communicate. I peeked through the peephole, but saw only darkness and the empty street. I called out, "Hello," but no one answered. When I opened the door, no one was there. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and a shiver ran down my spine. I double-locked the door and went back inside. I told myself it was some late-night prank, but the sinking feeling in my gut told me otherwise. Over the next week, the tapping grew more frequent. Sometimes it was at the windows, sometimes the doors. Sometimes it was a light scratching sound, like fingernails dragging on wood. Other times, the taps were louder, more insistent. I began to dread going to bed. One night, as I lay awake listening, I heard a soft whisper, just outside the window by my bed. It sounded like a voice calling my name. "Emily." I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I hadn't told anyone I lived alone. Who could know my name? The voice repeated, this time louder and more desperate. "Emily, let me in." I turned on the bedside lamp and looked out. The yard was empty except for the gnarled branches of the old oak tree that cast strange shadows in the porch light. No one was there. No footprints, no signs of disturbance. I locked every door and window that night and slept with the lights on. The following day, I researched the house's history. The landlord had said little, only that the previous tenant left after a few months without explanation. Digging through public records, I discovered something chilling. 10 years earlier, a young woman named Emily had lived in the house. She was found dead in the backyard under the oak tree, ruled an accidental fall, though some whispered it might have been foul play. I couldn't help but feel a connection. That night, I set up my phone on a tripod by the window, recording. Hours passed with silence until the clock hit 2:17 a.m. Suddenly, my phone's speaker crackled to life. There was a faint tapping on the glass, then the voice, unmistakably female, soft but urgent. "Help me, please." My heart slammed against my ribs. I wanted to scream, to run, but I sat frozen, gripping the phone as the voice faded and the tapping stopped. The next morning, I showed the footage to my best friend, Mark. He was skeptical, but agreed to come stay a few nights. That night, with Mark beside me, the tapping started again, louder and more frantic. I felt a cold breeze brush my arm, though all the windows were closed. The whispering grew louder, and Mark swore he saw a pale figure standing near the oak tree outside, barely visible in the moonlight. We stayed up all night, speaking to the air, asking what it wanted. In the early hours, the voice answered again. "Find him. Find him," I asked. "Who? What do you mean?" No response. Then silence. The next day, Mark and I looked into local news archives. Emily had been dating a man named James, who vanished mysteriously shortly after her death. Rumors said he was abusive, and some suspected he had something to do with her fall, but he was never charged or found. The house felt heavier after that, the air thick with sorrow and unresolved pain. The tapping continued every night, more urgent, more desperate. I started hearing footsteps pacing the porch outside, soft but deliberate. Sometimes I caught a glimpse of a shadow moving just beyond the window's edge. One night I woke to the front door rattling violently. Someone or something was trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, but the screen was dead again. I yelled for help, but my voice sounded hollow in the empty house. The door stopped shaking and silence fell again. The next day I was exhausted, terrified. Mark insisted we do something, anything, to help the restless spirit. We contacted a local medium who came to the house. She told us that Emily's spirit was trapped, confused, wanting justice for what happened to her. She said the tapping and knocking were attempts to communicate, to plead for help. That night, the medium led a small ritual, lighting candles and speaking softly to the spirit. For hours, nothing happened. Then, just before dawn, the knocking ceased. The whispering stopped. The house felt lighter, less oppressive. I stayed one more night, feeling the silence keenly. In the morning, I packed my bags. I couldn't live with the memory and presence any longer. As I left, I glanced back at the old oak tree. For a moment, I thought I saw a faint figure standing beneath it, watching. I've never returned. Sometimes when the wind is just right, I swear I still hear tapping on the glass and a soft whisper in the night. Emily is still out there, waiting. Story. The end. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone. It was a cold November night, the kind that chills your bones even inside a heated apartment. I lived alone in a small, two-bedroom place on the outskirts of town, quiet, tucked away behind old trees and a long stretch of gravel driveway. My closest neighbor was a good quarter-mile away, so I was used to absolute silence at night. But that night, around 11:30 p.m., I heard something. At first it was faint, just the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel, slow and steady. I froze, my eyes fixed on the dimly lit window near my bed. The sound stopped just outside my apartment door. Then came a soft knock. One knock. Pause. Then two more, evenly spaced. I wasn't expecting anyone. I never did. I don't even have many friends nearby. The feeling that something was off crept up my spine. My heart rate quickened, but I told myself it was probably just some drunk wandering or an animal making noise. I didn't answer the door, just pulled the blankets tighter and told myself to ignore it. The footsteps receded. I fell asleep eventually, but my dreams were restless. The next morning, I checked the door and porch. Nothing unusual. No footprints, no signs someone had been there. It was just gravel, scattered leaves, and the soft frost that had settled overnight. I shrugged it off. Maybe I'd been imagining things. But the same thing happened the following night, only worse. This time, the footsteps were heavier, almost deliberate. I heard the gravel crunch under boots, slow and steady, pacing back and forth like someone searching or waiting. Then the knocking started again, 3 slow knocks, followed by a pause, then 2 more. It was so clear I could even hear the faint scraping of something metal against the doorframe. I mustered the courage to peek through the peephole. There was no one there, just empty darkness. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I looked through the window beside the door, but the porch light flickered and then went out, leaving the area pitch black. I locked all the doors and windows tighter than usual that night and sat with a knife in my hand, listening to the silence. I thought about calling the police, but what could I say? Someone knocking outside? No one there? They'd probably think I was crazy. Still, I felt watched. Days passed. The knocking and footsteps came every night, always starting around 11:30 p.m., never earlier, never later. I tried to catch whoever it was by turning on all the lights and staying near the door, but the footsteps stopped before I got close. I told a coworker about it, expecting him to laugh it off. Instead, he got serious. "Where do you live again?" I gave him the address. "That place used to be an old farm," he said quietly. "Before the town grew around it, some folks say a man named Samuel was killed there in the 1920s. No one really knows what happened. He just disappeared one night. Some say he was murdered, others say he just vanished." I didn't believe in ghosts. I was a rational person. But that night, the knocking came again. I waited near the door. 3 slow knocks, then silence. I whispered, "Who's there?" No answer. I called out, "What do you want?" A voice, barely audible, whispered back, "Let me in." I shivered. I didn't open the door. The knocking stopped. The footsteps faded. I spent the rest of the night pacing, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Over the next week, I researched everything I could about the place. I found a few old newspaper clippings about a man named Samuel, who had lived on the property back when it was a farm. The reports mentioned a violent storm the night he disappeared, but no bodies were ever found. Local legends said his ghost haunted the area, searching for something he lost. I was skeptical, but the stories gave me chills. One night, I decided to set up an old camera on the porch with motion detection. I wanted proof, one way or another. When I reviewed the footage the next day, my blood ran cold. There was a blurry figure standing just outside the door, completely still, staring straight at the camera. The figure wore a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. Then, after about 15 minutes, the figure vanished into thin air. I showed the video to a friend who believed in spirits. He told me, "That's him, Samuel. He's trapped here, trying to reach out." I didn't know what to think. The next nights were worse. Sometimes the knocking was frantic, like someone desperately trying to get in. Sometimes the footsteps circled the porch, pacing closer and farther away. One night, the knocking was replaced by a soft crying. I stood frozen in the dark, listening to the sorrowful sounds, feeling a presence just beyond the door. I whispered. The voice, faint but clear, replied, "Help me." I wanted to run. I wanted to lock myself away forever. But something inside me, something compassionate, pushed me to open the door. I cracked it open an inch. A cold breeze swept in, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. There was no one there, just footprints in the gravel leading toward the woods behind my apartment. I grabbed my coat and followed the path. The deeper I went, the thicker the fog became, curling around tree trunks and creeping along the ground. I came to a large oak tree, its bark gnarled and scarred. Carved into the wood were the initials SH and a date, 1923. Suddenly, the air turned icy. I heard a whisper, a voice filled with pain and longing. "Thank you." I turned slowly. There was the man, the ghostly figure, his eyes sad but grateful. He smiled faintly, then faded away like smoke. From that night on, the footsteps stopped. The knocking ceased, the crying was silent, and for the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. I never saw Samuel again. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear soft footsteps on the gravel and a faint whisper carried on the breeze. It's a reminder that some spirits don't rest until someone listens. Story the end. It was late November when the knocking started. I had just moved into a small, older house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of a mid-sized city. The kind of place where people knew each other but kept mostly to themselves. The house itself was a fixer-upper, built in the 1940s, with hardwood floors and a creaky porch. I liked it. It felt cozy and peaceful, especially after years of living in cramped apartments. I was single at the time, working long hours as a nurse, often getting home late. The first night I heard the knocking, I was alone and exhausted. I had just showered and was getting ready to go to bed when there it was, a faint tapping at the front door. It was slow and rhythmic, just 3 knocks. I paused, my heart jumping. Who could be at the door at this hour? I wasn't expecting anyone. I peeked through the peephole, but saw nothing but darkness. The porch light flickered, casting long shadows. It bathed, but no one was there. I called out, "Hello," but the only answer was silence. I stepped back, locked the door, and tried to convince myself it was a prank, or maybe just the wind knocking against something loose. The next morning, I found muddy footprints on the porch. The ground was dry, and the previous night had been cold and clear, so it was strange. The footprints looked old and were scattered, as if someone had been pacing back and forth. I cleaned the porch and told myself it was probably some late-night wanderer or neighborhood kids messing around. But the knocking didn't stop. Over the next week, the knocking happened nearly every night. Always 3 slow taps, never more, never less. Sometimes at the front door, sometimes at the back. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed, jumping at every sound. One night, after a particularly grueling shift, I came home around 1 a.m. I was tired, hungry, and ready for sleep. As soon as I opened the door, I felt it, a cold, heavy stillness in the air. The house felt darker than usual, the shadows deeper. I closed the door behind me and headed to the kitchen for water. That's when the knocking began. 3 slow taps, this time from the living room window. It was the window next to the front door, the one I kept locked and covered with heavy curtains. I froze. There was no way anyone could be outside without me seeing them. I switched on the porch light and slowly pulled back the curtain. Nothing. No footprints in the garden, no sign of anyone hiding. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. The knocking started again, now from the back door. 3 taps, slow and deliberate. I moved toward the back door, flashlight in hand. I opened the door a crack, but still no one was there. Just the cold night air and the rustling leaves. I locked all the doors and windows again and called a friend to come over, too shaken to be alone. My friend Mark arrived within the hour. We spent the rest of the night talking and trying to shake off the creeping dread. Mark told me stories about the house. Apparently, the previous owner had been an older man who died alone in that house a few years ago. He was reportedly reclusive, with no known family, and neighbors said they sometimes heard strange noises at night. The police were called a few times for complaints about banging and knocking, but nothing ever serious enough to investigate deeply. That night, we both stayed awake, listening. Around midnight, the knocking began again. 3 taps on the front door. Mark stood and opened the door cautiously. No one, but the porch light flickered violently and went out, plunging us into darkness. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him. We both jumped. The knocking stopped. I tried to turn on the lights, but the breaker had tripped. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I reached for my phone. No signal, no power. The silence was suffocating. We sat in the dark for hours, trying to stay calm. As dawn broke, the power returned and the door was unlocked. Mark left early that morning, leaving me alone once again. After that night, things got worse. Objects moved on their own. Doors creaked open by themselves. Sometimes, I would hear footsteps pacing the hallway outside my bedroom, even though I was alone. One night, I woke up to whispering. It was so faint I could barely catch the words, but they sounded like someone pleading. "Help me." I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was a dream. But the knocking continued, always 3 taps, always slow and deliberate. Determined to find out more, I visited the local historical society. I learned that the house was built on land where a family had once lived in the late 1800s. There was a tragic fire that had killed the father and his young daughter, and the house had been rebuilt years later. Some locals believed the land was cursed, haunted by the restless spirits of those who died there. The more I learned, the more I realized that the knocking wasn't just random. It was a message. One cold night, after hearing the knocking at the back door, I finally gathered the courage to open it. No one was there, but I noticed something new. Fresh footprints in the dirt leading away from the door into the woods behind my yard. Curious, I followed them. They led to an old, half-buried well. I shined my flashlight inside and saw a faint glimmer. I called the fire department to report it, and they sent a crew to inspect. The well was old and dangerous, but they found nothing else. That night, the knocking stopped for the first time in weeks. I thought maybe whatever was haunting the house had moved on. But a week later, I woke up to a cold breeze on my face. I looked out the window. There, standing in the shadows of the yard, was a figure. Tall, thin, with no discernible features, just a dark silhouette. I blinked, and it was gone. From then on, I started seeing the figure more often, at the edge of my vision, standing outside my windows, lurking in the shadows. It felt less like a visitor and more like a warning. The knocking resumed, but sometimes it was accompanied by tapping on the windows and scratching on the door. One night, desperate, I left the house and stayed with a friend. When I returned the next day, I found my front door wide open. Nothing was missing, but the feeling of safety was shattered. I sold the house soon after. Even now, years later, whenever I hear knocking, 3 slow taps, I feel a cold dread wash over me. Sometimes I wonder who's really outside. Story the end. It was early autumn when I moved into the small house at the end of Maple Street. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew each other by name, but mostly kept to themselves. I had taken the job offer across town and needed a place close enough to walk, but far enough to feel like I had my own space. The house itself was modest, a single-story ranch with peeling white paint and a small front porch. The previous owner was an elderly man who had passed away recently. The realtor said the house had been on the market for months. The first few days were peaceful, maybe even comforting. The fall breeze rustled the leaves outside, and I felt a strange calm I hadn't had in years. But as night fell on the 3rd day, that calm started to unravel. Around midnight, I was lying in bed reading when I heard a faint noise from outside the window, a tapping, like someone lightly drumming their fingers against the glass. I froze, heart racing. The window faced the front porch, which was dimly lit by a flickering street lamp. I held my breath and stared, but saw nothing. When the tapping stopped, I told myself it was probably a branch brushing against the glass or a bird landing on the sill. The following night, the tapping returned, only this time it was louder and more persistent. I pulled back the curtains slowly and peered out. The porch was empty, the light dim, but I could see muddy footprints on the wooden floor. They weren't mine. I'd cleaned thoroughly before unpacking. The prints were large and bare. No shoes, no socks, just the imprint of foot. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was imagining things. Still, I made sure to lock all the doors and windows that night. Over the next week, things escalated. The tapping turned into knocking, slow and rhythmic. It wasn't always on the window. Sometimes it came from the front door or the side porch. Occasionally, I'd hear faint footsteps pacing just outside, never quite passing the porch light's reach. I set up a security camera pointing at the front door. The camera was motion activated, infrared equipped for night vision. I wanted proof of what I was hearing and seeing. On the third night after installing the camera, I woke to the porch light flickering on. I scrambled to the laptop beside my bed and pulled up the live feed. On the screen just outside the front door stood a figure, tall and thin, wearing a long dark coat and a hood pulled low over the face. The figure didn't move for several minutes, just stood silently staring at the door. My heart pounded so loud I was sure the figure could hear it. Then the figure slowly raised one hand and tapped 3 times on the door. The tapping was deliberate, unnatural, almost mechanical. Suddenly, the figure turned and vanished into the darkness as if swallowed by the night itself. The feed immediately cut out, the screen flickering and going black. I grabbed my phone and called a friend, explaining what I had just seen. She suggested I might be exhausted or stressed from the move and work. I wasn't so sure. The next day, I found muddy footprints again, larger than my shoe size, barefoot and leading from the driveway to the porch, but nowhere else. The prints disappeared abruptly at the porch step as if the person had vanished. I decided to check the history of the house. I visited the town's library and spoke to the librarian, who pulled old newspaper clippings from the 1940s. Apparently, the house once belonged to a man named Walter Green, a recluse who was rumored to be mentally unstable. Locals said he was often seen wandering the streets late at night, muttering to himself. One night, after a heated argument with his wife, he vanished and was never seen again. The house was abandoned for years after that. I shared the story with my friend, who said, "Sounds like he's still around, trying to come home." The tapping, footsteps, and presence continued nightly. I installed extra locks and even a heavy chain lock on the door, but nothing deterred the visitor. The knocking grew louder, more urgent, sometimes accompanied by low whispering that I could never quite make out. One night, I was awoken by the front door rattling violently, as if someone was trying to force it open. I froze in bed, paralyzed by fear. The knocking stopped suddenly, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I checked the camera feed in the morning. The footage showed the door rattling back and forth, but no figure appeared. Yet, when I went outside, the porch had been disturbed, leaves scattered, the wind chimes swaying though there was no breeze. The experiences began to affect me mentally. I started dreading nightfall, living in constant anxiety. Friends noticed I was jumpy, exhausted. I confided in a local pastor who came by to bless the house. He walked through every room, praying quietly. When he reached the front door, his face turned pale. "There's a heavy presence here," he said. "This spirit is restless, trapped between worlds." He recommended a cleansing ritual to help the spirit find peace. I agreed, desperate for relief. That night, we lit candles and incense, recited prayers, and sprinkled holy water around the perimeter of the house. As the ritual went on, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. I could feel a cold breath on my neck, and a faint whisper drifted through the air. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the front door, 3 sharp, insistent raps. I held my breath. The pastor opened the door cautiously, but no one was there. Just the empty night, the porch bathed in pale moonlight. The knocking never returned after that night. The footsteps ceased. The tapping stopped. I stayed in the house for another 6 months, and though I never fully felt comfortable again, the presence was gone. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right and the porch light flickers, I swear I can hear soft tapping from the window. And every now and then, when I'm alone in the dark, I catch a glimpse of a shadow standing just beyond the edge of the yard, watching, waiting. Story the end. It was early October when I moved into the old house on Maple Street, a small, unassuming neighborhood on the outskirts of town. I'd just come out of a rough breakup and needed a fresh start, someplace quiet, away from the noise and the constant buzz of my previous apartment in the city. The house was cheap, a little rundown, but it had character. The previous owner was an elderly woman who had lived there for decades, and neighbors told me the place had a peaceful energy about it. I was looking forward to settling in. The first few days were uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking and fixing little things around the house. The walls were thin, and the creaks of the floorboards reminded me that it was an old place. But I liked that. It made me feel grounded somehow, connected to history. One night, about a week after moving in, I was lying in bed around 11:30 p.m. The room was dark except for the soft glow of the streetlight outside filtering through the curtains. I was half asleep when I heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps outside, pacing back and forth beneath my bedroom window. It was slow and deliberate, heavy footsteps against the gravel driveway. At first, I thought maybe it was a neighbor walking their dog or someone out for a late stroll. The neighborhood was quiet, but not completely deserted. I tried to ignore it, convinced I was just imagining things, and eventually drifted off. The next night, the footsteps returned, this time louder and closer. They circled the house, moving from the front porch around to the side and back. I listened, heart pounding, as the sound paused just below my window, then continued. I got up, looked out, but there was nothing. No shadow, no figure, no sign of anyone. The gravel driveway was undisturbed. I locked the windows tighter, pulled the curtains shut, and tried to calm myself. Maybe an animal? But the steps were too heavy, too measured. For the next few nights, the same pattern repeated, pacing footsteps circling the house, always between 11 and 1 a.m. The tapping started too. Light knocks on the door, sometimes on the windows, like someone trying to get my attention without making a scene. I called the police once. They came out, checked the perimeter, and found nothing. No footprints in the gravel, no evidence of trespassers. They told me to install security cameras. I did. The footage was baffling. Each night, the cameras showed nothing. Nothing. No person, no animal, just empty yards and trees swaying in the wind. Yet the sounds persisted. One night, while reviewing footage, I saw a figure standing just outside the front door, barely visible in the darkness. It was tall and thin, standing perfectly still. When the porch light flicked on, the figure disappeared. I showed the clip to a friend who was into paranormal investigation. He was intrigued and came over to set up more equipment. That night, as the footsteps started again, the devices recorded strange spikes in electromagnetic fields around the windows and doors. Temperatures dropped inexplicably. The sound sensors picked up faint whispers too low to understand, but clearly not random noise. I began to feel watched all the time. The sensation was oppressive, like something was waiting, lingering just beyond the edge of sight. One night, I woke to a knock at the back door. I didn't want to open it. I stood frozen, heart racing, listening as the knocking continued. Slow, deliberate. Then a soft voice whispered my name. I never opened that door. The next morning, I found scratches on the wooden porch floorboards near the door. They looked like symbols or letters, but worn and almost illegible. I searched through old town records and newspaper archives, trying to find any history of the house or its previous inhabitants. I discovered that nearly 80 years ago, a woman named Elizabeth Morgan had lived in the house. She disappeared mysteriously one autumn night, the same time of year as now. Her husband was suspected but never charged, and the case went cold. Locals whispered about her restless spirit wandering the property, unable to find peace. That explained the tapping, the pacing. It explained the whispers calling my name. I was terrified, but also fascinated. I felt connected to her somehow, like she was reaching out for help. I invited a medium to come and attempt a communication session. During the session, the temperature dropped drastically. The medium's voice trembled as she described a presence, a woman trapped between worlds, desperate and lost. The medium told me Elizabeth was trying to warn me, to get me to uncover the truth about what happened to her. I spent weeks digging until finally I found an old diary tucked away in a forgotten corner of the local library archives. It was Elizabeth's. The entries told of abuse, of fear, and of a desperate plan to escape her husband's cruelty. The last entry was a chilling plea. If someone finds this, please know I am not gone. Someone is outside, someone who will not let me leave. After that, the pacing stopped, the knocking ceased. The oppressive feeling lifted. But late at night, sometimes I still hear faint footsteps outside my window, soft tapping on the glass, as if Elizabeth is still out there, watching, waiting. I don't believe in ghosts, but this house made me question everything, because sometimes when you're alone and the world is silent, you realize You're not as alone as you thought. Story. The end. The first time I noticed something was wrong was on a night just like any other. I had moved into my new apartment only a few weeks prior, a modest one-bedroom on the second floor of an aging building in a quiet part of town. It was peaceful most of the time, except for the occasional creak of the old floors or the hum of the radiator in winter. I liked the place. It was mine. And after years of living with roommates and noise, I finally had some solitude. That night, I was lying on the couch watching a movie. It was about 11 p.m., and the city was mostly quiet outside, the occasional car passing by in the distance. Max, my golden retriever, was curled up at my feet, snoring softly. The soft glow of the TV lit the room, and the shadows danced on the walls. Suddenly, Max lifted his head and growled low in his throat. I frowned and looked toward the window facing the alley behind the building. The street lamp outside flickered weakly, thus barely illuminating the narrow passage. At first I thought maybe a raccoon or stray cat had wandered through, but then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on gravel, getting closer to my door. I sat up, heart suddenly racing. The sound stopped just outside the building, right beneath my window. Max's growling turned into an anxious whine, and his eyes were fixed on the window. I moved closer, peering out through the blinds. The alley was empty, the gravel undisturbed. The shadows were still, but the air seemed colder than before. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a neighbor coming home late. I closed the blinds and returned to the couch, though Max stayed alert, his ears twitching. The footsteps never came again that night. The next morning, I noticed something odd near the window. There were faint smudges on the glass, almost like someone had pressed their hands there, but wiped them away hurriedly. I lived alone and didn't smoke or cook anything that could leave such marks. I cleaned the glass, but kept thinking about it. Over the next few nights, the footsteps returned, always around the same time, between midnight and 2 a.m., always slow, sometimes pausing, sometimes circling the building. Max refused to sleep in the bedroom, staying by the front door, growling or barking at nothing visible. One night, as I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, the sound of a doorbell ringing startled me. But I don't have a doorbell. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened carefully. It rang 3 times, slow and deliberate. I didn't answer. The ringing stopped, replaced by a faint whispering, too soft to make out words. Max whimpered, his whole body trembling. I switched on all the lights, locked the door, and waited until dawn. The next day, I asked my neighbor if she had heard anything strange. She said she sometimes hears noises late at night, but thought it was just the wind or old pipes settling. I didn't mention the doorbell or whispers. The days passed, and the presence outside my door grew more oppressive. One night, I heard scratching on the walls near the entrance, like fingernails scraping. I sat frozen, clutching my phone, the screen casting a pale light in the dark room. When I checked the security camera I had installed by the door, I saw a shadowy figure standing just outside, motionless. It wasn't a person. It flickered, like static on a bad TV signal. The figure vanished after a moment, leaving only the empty hallway. Terrified, I called a local paranormal investigator. He came the next evening, setting up his gear. Around midnight, the EMF reader near the door started beeping wildly. Footsteps echoed outside again, then the doorbell rang, even though no one was there. The investigator told me this was a spirit, attached to the building, unable to rest. He said it was asking to be let in. I felt sick. I tried speaking to it, telling it I wasn't afraid, but that had to leave me alone. The whispers stopped for a while. But then one night, the doorbell rang nonstop, the voice grew angry, and I was forced to flee. I never returned. I still wonder if it waits outside my door, wanting in. Story the end.